Imagine sitting inside a tiny metal box, hundreds of thousands of miles away from every human being you have ever loved. The pitch-black, silent emptiness of the universe stares back at you through a tiny glass window. You are falling toward a barren, gray rock at thousands of miles per hour. Suddenly, the master alarm blares. A piercing, terrifying siren echoes directly inside your helmet. The computer is failing. The fuel is almost completely gone. You look down through the window, and instead of a smooth landing area, you see a deadly field of massive ship-destroying boulders rapidly approaching. If you crash, no one is coming to save you. If you survive the crash, but the ship is damaged, you will never take off again. You will sit there, trapped in the cold dark, slowly suffocating as you watch the distant glowing blue sphere of Earth until your oxygen finally runs completely dry. This is not a scene from a Hollywood science fiction movie. This was the absolute terrifying reality of July 20th, 1969. We all know the famous words spoken on that day: one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But what they did not tell you on the fuzzy black and white television broadcasts was how incredibly close it all came to absolute disaster. Welcome, fellow explorers. Today we are pulling back the curtain on the greatest, most dangerous adventure in human history. We are going to explore the dark, hidden, and heart-pounding secrets of the Apollo 11 moon landing. Forget the polished history books. Get comfortable, because this journey will take you to the very edge of your seat, and you will never look at the moon the exact same way ever again. To truly understand the immense courage of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, we must first travel back to the late 1960s. The world was trembling on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent, deadly struggle known as the Cold War. It was not just a battle of weapons, but a battle for the absolute survival of a way of life. Whoever controls the high ground of space controls the world. And up until this point, the Soviet Union had humiliated America at every single milestone. They launched the first satellite. They sent the first animal into orbit. They put the first human being into space. The American public was gripped by a deep, paralyzing fear. The beautiful night sky above them was no longer a peaceful canopy of stars. It was a terrifying new high ground, a place where Soviet nuclear missiles could rain down at any moment. President John F. Kennedy knew he had to do something impossible to restore the spirit of the nation. He stood before the world and promised to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. It was a breathtakingly bold promise, but the terrifying truth was that the technology required to do this did not even exist. They were basically agreeing to build a parachute after they had already jumped out of the airplane. The men who volunteered for this mission were not fearless superheroes. They were brilliant, calculating test pilots who knew exactly how easily they could die. Just 2 years before Apollo 11, the nightmare became reality. The Apollo 1 tragedy shook the entire nation to its core. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were locked inside their command module on the launch pad, conducting what was supposed to be a routine test. But the atmosphere inside the capsule was pumped full of pure oxygen. A single stray spark from a frayed wire instantly ignited a raging, uncontrollable inferno. Because the capsule was highly pressurized, the hatch slammed shut like a vault. The men burned alive, screaming for help over the radio, trapped in a fire hotter than a blast furnace, while rescue crews desperately tried to open the door. It was over in minutes. It was a brutal, sickening reminder that space does not forgive. It kills without hesitation, without mercy. Neil, Buzz, and Michael knew those men intimately. They wept for their friends. And they knew with absolute certainty as they prepared for their own mission that they could suffer the exact same agonizing fate.
The machine designed to carry them away from Earth was a monster of engineering. The Saturn V rocket was not just a vehicle, it was a massive, controlled explosion. Standing an unbelievable 363 feet tall, it was packed with millions of pounds of highly explosive aviation fuel and liquid oxygen. When you ignite that much volatile liquid, you are not truly flying. You are strapping yourself to the tip of a giant bomb and hoping it blows up in the right direction. Every single one of the rocket's 3 million intricate parts was built by the lowest government bidder. Let that horrifying thought sink into your mind for a moment. 3 million parts, and if even one tiny valve, one wire, or one seal failed at the wrong moment, the astronauts would be vaporized into a cloud of atomic dust before they even knew what happened. The danger was so immense, so incredibly undeniable, that the highest levels of the United States government did not truly believe the men would survive. Behind closed doors in the White House, President Richard Nixon had a top-secret speech prepared, locked away in a desk drawer. The classified document was titled, "In Event of Moon Disaster." The words written on that paper are deeply chilling. It began with a heavy sentence. "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." The emergency protocol was terrifyingly simple and incredibly cruel. If the lunar module crashed, or if the ascent engine failed to ignite to bring them back home, Mission Control in Houston would be forced to cut off all radio contact. Neil and Buzz would be left entirely alone, 240,000 miles away from their families, with only a limited supply of oxygen remaining in their tanks. They would have to make an impossible choice. They could sit in the freezing cold module and wait to slowly suffocate, or they could open the airlock, exposing themselves to the brutal vacuum of space to end their suffering quickly. A clergyman back on Earth would perform a burial at sea ritual, commending their souls to the deepest of the deep, while the men were still technically alive, looking up at the beautiful blue marble they could never return to. On the humid morning of July 16, 1969, the three men walked down the long steel corridor toward their waiting spacecraft. They wore their heavy, bulky white spacesuits, carrying portable oxygen ventilators. Their faces were stoic and calm, expertly hiding the raging storm of anxiety and adrenaline beneath. They crawled into the tiny command module named Columbia and strapped themselves in tightly. Outside, 1 million people had gathered on the beaches of Florida to watch history unfold, while hundreds of millions more sat glued to their televisions around the globe. The countdown voice echoed like thunder across the marshlands. 10, 9, 8, ignition sequence starts. The mighty F-1 engines roared to life, unleashing a torrent of golden fire. The sound was so violently loud that it literally shook the ground miles away, registering on local seismographs like a massive earthquake. Inside the tiny capsule, the astronauts were violently slammed back into their heavy seats. 7.5 million pounds of thrust physically threw them toward the heavens. They were crushed by the immense G-forces, their chests compressed so tightly that their breathing became shallow gasps. The metal hull around them groaned, shrieked, and rattled violently. It felt as though the entire ship was going to violently tear itself apart piece by piece. The vibration blurred their vision. And then, suddenly, a profound, eerie silence. The engines cut off. They were floating. They were in orbit. They had survived the first impossible test, but the nightmare was only just beginning. Surviving the launch was merely the opening act. Now came the translunar injection, the critical engine burn that would aggressively tear them away from the comforting safety of Earth's gravity and send them coasting across the vast, terrifying emptiness of deep space. For 3 long days, they floated inside a tiny metallic bubble, hurtling through absolute nothingness. The silence of deep space is something the human brain struggles to comprehend. There is no wind blowing outside, no weather, no birds, no background noise whatsoever. There is only the constant, monotonous hum of the life support fans, the only thin line keeping them from freezing to death or suffocating in the hostile, radiation-filled void. Out their small window, the Earth, their home, grew smaller and smaller, shrinking from a massive, vibrant blue sphere into a fragile, vulnerable little marble hanging suspended in a limitless black ocean.
As they finally approached the moon, a brand new terror awaited them in the dark. To safely enter lunar orbit, they had to fly directly behind the dark side of the moon and fire their main engine to aggressively slow down. This was the most dangerous maneuver of the flight thus far, because the massive physical body of the moon completely blocked all radio signals back to Earth. For 45 agonizing, suffocating minutes, Mission Control in Houston sat in absolute dead silence. If the spacecraft engine fired for even a few seconds too long, they would lose too much speed and crash violently into the rugged lunar surface. If the engine fired for too short of a time, they would not be captured by the moon's gravity, and they would be helplessly slingshotted out into the infinite blackness of deep space, lost forever in the freezing solar system, with absolutely no way to ever turn around. The entire world held its collective breath. Grown men in Mission Control sweated through their white shirts. The seconds ticked by like agonizing hours. And then, finally, the static cracked and cleared. Apollo 11 emerged out from behind the shadow of the moon. The engine had worked flawlessly. They were successfully in orbit. Now came the ultimate, unforgiving challenge. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin squeezed through the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel into the fragile lunar module, affectionately named Eagle. Michael Collins remained behind by himself in the command module. He was the designated survivor. If Neil and Buzz died on the surface below, Michael would have to start the engine and fly back to Earth completely alone. He would be the loneliest man in the history of the universe, carrying the unimaginably heavy burden of leaving his best friends behind as corpses on a dead world. As Neil and Buzz undocked the Eagle and began their steep, harrowing descent toward the alien surface, the tension inside Mission Control reached a breaking point. Young engineers in their 20s, chain-smoking cigarettes to calm their nerves, stared intensely at the flickering green data screens. The Eagle was heading down, dropping like a stone toward the sea of tranquility. But deep space is a master of cruel and sudden surprises. As the fragile, paper-thin lunar module dropped closer to the alien terrain, something went horribly, terribly wrong. The radio communications started dropping in and out, replaced by horrible blasts of static. Houston was rapidly losing data. Without a steady stream of data, Mission Control could not tell if the ship was flying on the correct path or if it was plummeting upside down toward its doom. Suddenly, the guidance computer became overwhelmed. The bright warning lights illuminated the dark cabin. The dreaded 1202 program alarm flashed angrily on the display. The navigation computer, the absolute brain of the ship, was fatally overloading. It was receiving entirely too much radar information and was threatening to completely restart itself. If the computer restarted now, they would instantly lose all navigation. They would be flying completely blind. The rules dictated that they had to abort the mission immediately, but if they aborted at this speed, the violent force could tear the ship apart, or worse, they might crash directly into the moon. Neil Armstrong's heart rate spiked to an incredible 150 beats per minute. He grabbed the manual controls, peering out the triangular window, only to see another catastrophic disaster unfolding right before his eyes. The faulty computer was flying them far off course, carrying them directly into a massive, terrifying crater surrounded by deadly obstacles. Boulders the absolute size of large houses loomed just below them, casting long black shadows on the gray dirt. If the fragile landing gear clipped even one of those massive rocks, the top-heavy ship would tip over entirely. If the ship fell on its side, the ascent engine would be pointing sideways. They could never, ever take off again. They would be stranded alive on the surface of the moon. Dead men walking.
Neil took full manual control, flying the falling spaceship like a helicopter, desperately searching for a smooth patch of dirt. But the descent engine was burning fuel at a massive rate. The low fuel warning light ignited. They had less than 60 seconds of usable fuel remaining before the engine would suck dry and shut off, dropping them like a rock out of the sky. The ultimate unthinkable nightmare was unfolding in real time. 60 seconds to land or die trying.
30 seconds. That was all the time separating life and death. The fuel gauge was practically empty. The descent engine was screaming, blasting the barren lunar surface and kicking up a massive, blinding storm of ancient gray dust. Neil Armstrong was flying, completely blind. The swirling dirt created an incredible optical illusion, making it entirely impossible to tell how fast they were moving sideways or how far they truly were from the hard ground. It was like driving a massive vehicle through a thick, heavy blizzard at night with no headlights. Buzz Aldrin was reading out the rapidly dropping altitude and speed numbers in a tight, incredibly tense voice. Down 2.5, forward, good, 20 feet. Down completely. The bright blue contact light dramatically illuminated the dashboard. Neil immediately shut off the engine. The massive, thunderous vibration abruptly stopped. A profound, heavy, and absolutely surreal silence filled the tiny metal cabin. They were not falling anymore. The fragile, completely battered lunar module had finally settled into the powdery dirt. Neil Armstrong took a deep, shaky breath, keyed his microphone, and spoke the words that would echo through human history for eternity. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Back in Texas, the flight controller let out a massive sigh of relief, famously responding that they had a room full of guys about to turn completely blue and they were finally breathing again. The terrifying, completely hidden reality was that they only had 16 seconds of usable fuel remaining. 16 tiny seconds away from a mandatory, violently aggressive abort that likely would have killed them both instantly. But the incredible danger was far from over. Landing was only the very first half of the miracle. Now they actually had to open the door and step outside into an environment so incredibly hostile that it actively wanted to destroy them. They strapped on their incredibly bulky, heavy white spacesuits. These suits were not just protective clothing, they were highly complex miniature spaceships meticulously tailored to the human body. The temperature outside in the direct, blinding sunlight was a boiling 260 degrees Fahrenheit. In the pitch-black shadows, it dropped instantly to a freezing -280 degrees. Without the complex water cooling tubes running actively through their suits, their blood would literally boil inside their veins within seconds of stepping out. Furthermore, the moon possessed absolutely no atmosphere to protect them from micrometeorites. Tiny, jagged rocks, smaller than a single grain of sand, were constantly shooting across the lunar surface at speeds 10 times faster than a high-powered sniper rifle bullet. If one of those completely invisible specks hit a vital part of the spacesuit, it would violently puncture the fabric, instantly sucking the precious oxygen out of the suit and suffocating the astronaut in extreme agony. They were walking out into a silent, invisible firing squad. When Neil finally opened the heavy metal hatch and slowly climbed down the golden ladder, his heart was pounding fiercely against his ribs. He planted his heavy boots into the gray, charcoal-like powder. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. The landscape stretching out before them was unlike anything human eyes had ever witnessed. It possessed a stark, terrifying, and profound beauty. There were absolutely no warm colors, only blindingly bright whites, deep grays, and shadows so incredibly dark and dense that stepping into them felt like stepping into a bottomless black pit. Above their heads, the sky was not a comforting blue. It was an endless, terrifying void of absolute pitch blackness, even in the very middle of the blazing lunar morning. And hanging silently in that vast, empty dark was a stunning, incredibly fragile blue and white jewel, the Earth.
Every person they had ever known, every historical event, every war, every beautiful love story existed entirely on that tiny speck, floating alone in the terrifying, unforgiving cosmos. It was a deeply humbling, almost completely paralyzing realization. The actual physical work on the surface was exhausting and incredibly dangerous. The lunar dust was completely unlike normal dirt back on Earth. Because there is no wind or water on the moon to smooth down the rocks over millions of years, the dust particles were incredibly jagged and sharp, exactly like millions of tiny shards of crushed microscopic glass. The dark dust clung stubbornly to absolutely everything. It covered their pristine white suits in a dark, abrasive soot. It got into the critical joints of their suits, aggressively grinding down the precious rubber seals that kept the deadly vacuum of space outside. When they finally returned to the cramped cabin after 2.5 exhausting hours, they took off their heavy helmets and were instantly hit with a highly surprising sensation. The moon actually had a very distinct smell. The jagged, electrified dust reacted with the pure oxygen inside the cabin, giving off a pungent, strong odor that smelled exactly like spent gunpowder or wet, burnt ashes. But the most terrifying, completely untold moment of the entire incredible mission happened just as they were preparing to leave. The space inside the lunar module was no larger than a tiny hallway closet. Two grown men wearing incredibly bulky spacesuits covered in sharp dust had to move around very carefully to avoid hitting the controls. While turning his body, Buzz Aldrin accidentally brushed his heavy life support backpack against the wall of the main control panel. He heard a very faint, deeply sickening snap. He immediately looked down at the dirty metal floor. Lying right there in the dark lunar dust was a tiny broken piece of black plastic. His blood ran instantly cold. He immediately looked up at the panel to see exactly what had broken. It was the circuit breaker switch for the main ascent engine, the absolute most critical switch in the entire spacecraft. Without pulling that specific button, the engine would never arm, it would never ignite. They would simply not be able to blast off the surface. They would be permanently stranded, turning the millions of dollars lunar module into a tiny, freezing metal coffin. Sheer, unimaginable panic slowly crept into the cabin. They radioed Houston immediately, explaining the incredibly catastrophic situation. The brilliant engineers back on Earth desperately scrambled to find a solution, but they were 240,000 miles away and utterly helpless. Hours painfully passed. Houston finally told the exhausted astronauts to try and get some sleep while they worked on an electrical bypass. Imagine trying to sleep in a freezing metal box millions of miles from your family, knowing with absolute certainty you might never wake up again. But Buzz Aldrin was an incredibly resourceful, brilliant engineer. He intensely studied the broken panel. He knew that the circuit breaker was carrying active, highly dangerous electricity. If he stuck his finger or a metal tool into the broken hole to trigger the switch, it would create a massive electrical short circuit, instantly sparking a fire that would incinerate them, or completely destroying the ship's electrical system forever. He desperately needed something non-conductive, something simple. He reached deep into his shoulder pocket and pulled out a basic, cheap felt-tip pen. When the terrifying countdown to launch finally began, Buzz carefully, with a violently shaking hand, inserted the plastic tip of the pen into the broken hole and pushed hard. The circuit connected. The bright green lights flashed on. The massive engine successfully armed. A homemade, incredibly cheap plastic pen had just saved the Apollo 11 mission from absolute disaster. The ascent engine roared to life with a violent, massive explosion, instantly blasting the top half of the fragile ship into lunar orbit, leaving the gold-foiled descent stage behind on the gray dirt forever. They successfully rendezvoused and docked with a deeply relieved Michael Collins in the command module. They were finally heading home. But the universe demands heavy payment for crossing its sacred boundaries. To make it back to the comforting safety of Earth, they had to survive a re-entry so incredibly brutal that it felt like driving a car directly into a brick wall made entirely of raging fire. Approaching the Earth's atmosphere at an unbelievable speed of 25,000 miles per hour, the command module violently slammed into the thick air. The friction was so incredibly intense that the protective heat shield began to literally melt and burn away, intentionally shedding the destructive heat to protect the vulnerable men inside. The temperature completely surrounding the tiny window reached an astounding 5,000 degrees. The capsule became entirely engulfed in a blindingly bright ball of superheated plasma. The intense, roaring fire completely cut off all radio communications. For 3 terrifying, agonizing minutes, the entire world waited in absolute paralyzing silence. This was the ultimate moment of truth. Had the heat shield critically cracked? Had a micrometeorite damaged the fragile parachute covers during the long journey? Were the astronauts currently burning alive as a falling, screaming star? Houston called out desperately through the heavy static. Apollo 11, Houston, do you copy? Total silence. Apollo 11, Houston, do you copy? The static cracked wildly. Suddenly, a calm, incredibly steady voice broke through the overwhelming noise. Houston, Apollo 11, we are okay. High above the sparkling Pacific Ocean, 3 massive, incredibly beautiful orange and white parachutes violently deployed, catching the heavy ocean air. The scorched, blackened, terribly battered metal capsule slammed hard into the deep blue water. They had done it. They had actually done it. They had touched the face of the unknown, danced on the very edge of absolute destruction, and miraculously returned to tell the tale. But even after splashing down, they couldn't simply breathe the fresh ocean air. The scientists back home were terrified that the moon might harbor microscopic alien pathogens, deadly space plagues that could wipe out all of humanity. The astronauts had to put on heavy biological isolation garments before even stepping out of the raft. They were immediately locked inside a tightly sealed trailer, strictly quarantined from the rest of the world for 3 long weeks. They could only look at their crying wives and smiling children through a thick pane of glass, waving silently, wondering if they were secretly carrying a silent, invisible doom. It was a stark, incredibly sobering reality check. They had conquered the stars, but they were still fragile, mortal humans terrified of the unseen. The Apollo 11 mission is not just an old story about incredibly complex machines or global politics. It is the ultimate, shining testament to the unbreakable, completely fearless human spirit. It deeply proves that when we face our deepest terrors, when we push past the incredibly comfortable boundaries of our fragile home, we are absolutely capable of achieving impossible miracles. Thank you for joining me on this incredible, heart-stopping journey through the dark and dangerous secrets of Apollo 11. If you felt the absolute thrill and tension of this untold story, please hit that like button right now. Your support helps us uncover more incredible hidden truths. And if you want to experience more breathtaking, highly detailed, and completely mind-blowing historical deep dives exactly like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. The universe is incredibly vast, and we have so many more incredible stories left to explore together. Stay curious, stay brave, and I will see you in the next adventure.